welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling, and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this session, we'll be understanding and dealing with the concept of JIT1 and JIT2, the learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by JIT1 and JIT2, that is JIT1 and JIT2, explain the various roles of operations planning in terms of JIT1 and JIT2, how to implement JIT1 and JIT2 in the organization. So now let's begin with our learning. First, initially, we'll understand what do we mean by JIT1 and JIT2. JIT, it is a full form of just in time, or a JIT. So inventory management is one of the major essential consideration in which the organization has to undertake various activities related to the control of inventory, that is stock in the organization. So the control or the process or the mechanism that is adopted to control the inventory or stock or the materials in the organization is called just in time, that is JIT. This method is been majorly used as a goal to lower the inventory holding cost while increasing the amount of inventory turnover. The inventory turnover ratio, which means or which deals with the amount of sales and the closing stock or the opening stock that is available in the organization with respect to a certain percentage and ratio is always accepted to be at a lower consent. When the inventory control ratio is being calculated, it focuses on what amount of inventory gets converted into the total sales and what is the amount of finished goods that have been produced in an organization. And hence, for those considerations, the control on inventory is essentially important. The concept of JIT, that is JIT, focuses on how do we control that inventory which is available in the stores department or the purchase department and how it is being utilized at an effective level. The JIT focuses on the various concepts such as zero inventory, zero lead time, zero delays, and zero failures. So these are the four factors or pillars on which the concept of JIT is being focused. Now let's understand what are the various procedures or activities that have been performed in case of an JIT work culture, that is just-in-time work culture. The first factor that it considers or the procedure that is being followed is long-term quality compliances. So in case of quality, we need to always see that the various compliances as to the long-term perspectives needs to be followed. What amount of quality of material is available in the organization? How do we control the quality of those goods and services, and so on. And hence, availability of goods and services for the short-term period or for the long-term period is essentially needs to be assessed, and on those particular perspectives, the quality compliances needs to be maintained in the inventory or the stores department. The multifunctional workers. In an organization or in a particular department, there are different levels of organization that have been undertaken. Those levels are low-level management, middle-level management, and top-level management. And at every levels of management, there are various functions that have been performed. And hence, when all or different types of functions have been performed, at every level, we have multifunctional workers who have been operating their activities. And hence, when we have a multifunctional working organization, at the same place, the usage of inventory or the usage of material at all levels is completely different. And from those particular basis, we need to understand and we need to identify as to how those multifunctional workers will be using the materials that have been required. So the JIT work culture essentially requires or needs how do we implement a functional organization and how all the workers have been associated for the better control on inventory. The third perspective is the concept of job enlargement. In case of a job enlargement, it is always focusing on how do we control the labor, how various quantities of goods, services, and materials will be available, and as well as how optimum utilization of those resources will be undertaken. And hence, job enlargement is essentially needed to be undertaken in case of how do we control the goods, services, and materials, and in one way, the enforcement of each and every activity with respect to a specified job needs to be undertaken by respective people or the individuals. The next perspective or the procedure or activity that has been followed is group incentive scheme. So in case of a group incentive scheme, one needs to identify as to if a particular team or a particular individual is working, then what incentive should be provided for the team or what incentive should be provided for an individual. The various group incentive schemes can be implemented in an organization to build a better work culture and develop a healthy workplace culture environment, which will create or increase the productivity of the organization in the long run. And as together, everyone will be the participants of the JIT work culture. The next perspective or the activity that has been performed is the quality circles. There are various quality circles that have been organized and arranged in which everyone needs to ascertain and identify as to how do we attain a quality in the long run or in the short term perspectives. The goods and the services that we are delivering to the customers should always be very qualitative in nature. And when we have a establishment of quality circles, the manufacturing process is always streamlined and all the activities are being conducted as per their designated time, path, way, and process. The next perspective is the long-term employment. Always, the JIT work culture focuses on how do we create the long-term employment and how the people in the organization remain sustained for the greater extent. Employment opportunities as to the people who are working or associated in the manufacturing department, stores department, finance, marketing department, and so on needs to be ascertained, and it always looks for a long-term growth of an organization. The other perspectives of or the activity that focuses on is the cross training. And hence, we need to always provide the cross-functional training to all the employees who are associated in a business organization. And we need to say that every employee or every worker is been trained in all the levels of management which is applicable. The JIT work culture, that is the just in time, always focuses on how we complete all the activities within a specific time period. And for completion of the activities in the specific time period, we need to provide an effective training and development to those employees or to those workers. And the last perspective is the flexible workforce. So the workforce or the environment in the organization must be very flexible and adaptable as per the need and requirements or changes that are needed to be accepted. And hence, flexible workforce is essentially maintained. And in order a particular organization needs to maintain, we have to see that a flexible work environment is also being provided so that employee feels comfortable in a large scale organization or in a small scale organization wherever they are working. Now let's understand what is the concept of JIT1 and JIT2 with respect to supply chain structure. So in case of a supply chain structure, we have a particular supplier of materials who has been providing or who has been sourcing out certain goods and services. The goods or the raw materials that have been required, they have been transported and they have been shipped from one location to another location. And hence, first we need to do is we need to identify a supplier. And when that particular supplier is being identified, the goods are being transmitted or they have been transferred from the materials department, that is from the supplier department to the factory department. And hence, at the factory level, the transportation of goods and services is being undertaken. When the goods reaches at a certain factory level, the goods undergo certain processes, and when the process has been undertaken as to the part of manufacturing, they go to a certain department which is called as an DC, that is the distribution chain. Then the various distribution centers are made available, and the distribution centers purchases those goods and services and commodities in the bulk or in the wholesale consideration. Then the second consideration we have is again the RDC, that is the various regional distribution centers in which the regional distribution centers are available, and they may be available at a region wise, at a city wise, at a location wise, and so on. After the regional distribution centers, we have the various retail outlets or the retail stores. So right from the supplier to the factory to the DC and to the RDC, the goods have been moving in one and one direction and always in a forward integration. And lastly, when the goods have been received at a retailer concern, there is a customer who approaches to a retailer and he wants to purchase those goods and services. And when those particular goods and services have been purchased by the customer, he provides an information about the quality of product. So when the information about the quality of product is being provided by the customer, then the information flows from customer to the manufacturer in again a backward integration. That is, the information gets passed on from customer to retailer, from retailer to RDC, from RDC to DC, and DC to the factory, and ultimately from factory to the supplier as to what type and quality and quantity of goods and services are being required, and how those goods services needs to be contained in an effective way. Now let's understand what are the 5 main principles of JIT. The first principle of JIT, that is just in time, is total quality management. The second is the production management. The third is the supplier management. The fourth is the concept of inventory management, and lastly, human resource management. So these are the various functions or the main principles on which the concept of JIT or JIT can be implemented, and they can be used, and accordingly we can implement a better consideration as to how do we create a qualitative product, and all the activities are being completed within a specific time period. Now let's take an example. So a firm that sells office furniture but does not produce it can order it from the manufacturers only if a client orders it. So A particular office furniture which has been purchased or which needs to be purchased by an organization, we can either purchase it directly from the manufacturer or we can get it from a client who's applicable as a retail market in a particular store or in a particular organization. And hence, the furniture can be purchased from various different sources or various different locations. So it's an example of an administrative purchase or an wholesale purchase that has been undertaken for the business consideration. It is delivered straight to the consumer by the manufacturer, and hence the business has saved money on the inventory storage. So, in a reverse example, wherein the office furniture is directly purchased from the manufacturer, then the concept of distribution chain as to the distributor, wholesaler, retailers, and so on is being elapsed, and the goods and services are directly transferred from the manufacturer to the customer. Now let's understand what are the various applications of just-in-time. The various applications of just-in-time are the product, the TQC, that is total quality management, the product planning, the inventory management, and lastly, the SCM, that is supply chain management. So the product design. So concept of product design focuses on what design of product we have, what is the composition of the products, the features, characteristics, color, design, shape of a particular product. So all these factors needs to be considered when we want to implement a concept of JIT, that is JIT, just in time. The concept of TQC, that is total quality control, is needed to be obtained only when we have finished products into existence. While the products have been moving in the various assembly lines, one organization needs to undertake about how those activities can be undertaken and how we can control the total quality in the entire manufacturing of operational process. The concept of product planning focuses on the movement of goods and services from the assembly line, that is right from the input of the material from the inventory or the stores department to the finished goods department, how the planning of production activity is being undertaken. The concept of the fourth factor of inventory focuses on the maintenance of level of inventory and the distribution of inventory, that is whether it is a LIFO method, last in first out method, first in first out method, simple average method, or weighted average. So on those particular basis, the inventory control techniques can be applied, and either one of the techniques, that is LIFO, FIFO, simple average, or weighted average, those can be used, and the various organizational control techniques of inventory can be undertaken. And lastly, the fifth factor is the supply chain integration. So supply chain management as to the movement of goods and services from one department to another department, from the organization to the distribution centers, and ultimately how does it reaches to the retailers and the consumers. Now let us understand what are the various 8 problems of just-in-time packaging supply, that is JIT. The first problem that has been associated is problem with the forecasting. Then we have the problem that has been associated with the coping with the sudden demand, additional training and planning that has been required, less control of the supply chain management activities, exceptional events or disasters that have been created, increased investment in IT infrastructure, reliance on a single supplier, and lastly, the customer satisfaction. So these are the various problems on which basis the problems can be identified, and we need to understand as to how just-in-time packaging supply activities can be taken and the qualitative products can be manufactured in the business organization. So that's the 8 problems that have been associated with the just-in-time. Now let's understand how do we implement the JIT, that is just-in-time. First thing we need to do is we need to examine our whole supplier chain activity, and on those particular basis, further decision needs to be undertaken. The second step that we need to do is work with the suppliers to establish a solid and long-term connections. And only whenever we have a proper connections and a long-term connections with the suppliers, we can implement a better JIT perspectives. The next consideration is be open and honest with your consumers. So we must be always open and honest to the consumers about providing a product information, sharing of knowledge, resources, and so on. The next perspective is seeking outside assistance with your supply chain management. So whatever outside assistance that has been required, we must seek that particular assistance or help, and accordingly, the various supply chain management activities needs to be undertaken in order to implement the better concept of JIT in the organization. And hence, the various operation management activities with respect to JIT1 and JIT2 is indeed the business function in charge of overseeing how do we conduct the manufacturing and distribution of goods and services in a very effective way. There are several categories that may be used to classify the major enablers and success factors for JIT adoption in the Indian manufacturing industry. Those particular categories or factors may be an organization's dedication and culture, employee engagement and commitment, supplier coordination and relationships, inventory levels, and lastly, the product variety. So now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what do we mean by JIT1 and JIT2, that is just in time. which planning is required in case of JIT 1 and JIT 2, and lastly, how to implement the JIT 1 and JIT 2 in a business environment or in manufacturing concern. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning in this particular session. We'll stay connected and we'll continue with our learning. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.